Hello, everyone. My name is Charlie, and welcome back to the Fifth Dimension, where I love to talk about anything related to Doctor Who. Today, we are doing a bit of a different video again. It's the third episode in the Best and Worst of Who podcast, and today we're going to be talking about the Pertwee era. So, as usual, I have a guest, and today we have someone who's a bit more prominent in HewTube, as they call it. We have Elliot from EMS Productions. How are you today, Elliot?
Hello. Yes, I'm very good. Thank you. I like how you said more prominent in YouTube. I don't like to think of myself as particularly, well known or anything, but I guess maybe some people have seen some of my videos. I don't know. Maybe.
I mean, yeah, it's like, I only started YouTube like about a year ago, maybe. Mm-hmm. About a year and a half ago, and you're here with like 8,000 subscribers, and it's pretty crazy.
Yeah, I do sometimes struggle to believe that I have 8,000 people who see my videos pop up on their phone every other day and whatever. It's kind of crazy. I've been doing it since kind of 7-8 years now, I think. So I guess, just takes a bit of time. But yeah I don't like to, think that, I've got all these people who follow me. I'd like to just make Doctor Who content and, chat about a show that I love, really. That's what it's all about.
Oh, yeah. So today we're going to be talking about the Pertwee era, an era which, when, someone says, what's your least favorite of Doctor Who? This is not an era that comes to mind, really. Like, even the worst of this era, people don't really consider to be that awful compared to maybe the Colin Baker era or season 24, season 17, which obviously we're going to be talking about in Van. People generally think of the Colin Baker era, the Jodie Whittaker era. They don't really think of this. This is considered a pretty brilliant era, really. And I've been really excited to talk about it, considering it's probably my favorite era. Mm-hmm. And definitely my favorite Doctor. So what are your overall thoughts on the era, Elliot?
Yeah, so it's interesting, isn't it? As you say, I don't think I've ever met somebody who says, I hate the Pertwee era. Like, I've met people and talked to people who are kind of, very sort of like, just it's there, it's okay. Like, it's just a piece, it's just a period of Doctor Who that isn't for them. But yeah, also, as you say, I've met a lot of people who really like them. I would say it's my absolute favorite era of the classic series, which there's a lot of it, so it's quite a significant part of that for me. I've always I've been watching classic Who for 15 years now, probably since I was about 8 or 9, and it was always these sort of Pertwee era of the classic alien invasion unit storylines that just really sort of brought me into Doctor Who even more so. Like, it's in many ways, it's a very atypical era of the show because obviously the Doctor is stuck on Earth for most of it, at least, until the middle of season 10, apart from, when they really ran out of story ideas and had to find a way to get him off Earth. But apart from that, he's, pretty much all of them are set on Earth with the unit family sort of surrounding it. And, as Terrance Dicks identified, you end up with 2 stories. You either have an alien invasion or a mad scientist storyline. I think they proved they were a bit more creative than that. But despite those kind of limitations to the format of Doctor Who that they hadn't had until that point, it's remarkable how well crafted this era is, how consistently good in quality this era is. Because most seasons of classic Who, all of Doctor Who, you look at it and there's 2 or 3 clangers in there. There's a couple, for every City of Death, there's a Horns of Nymon. Like, all these seasons have, generally have their, great highs, but also, really significant lows. Whereas I feel like apart from, maybe 2 or 3 stories in the Pertwee era, generally the quality of it is just so high. You just have consistently good storytelling and consistently good ideas. You've got great performances from all of the main cast. And because you've got that kind of unit family, as it's described, that solid set of regulars rather than just the Doctor plus companion turning up with a new set of guest casts every week, I think that just allows you to kind of enter into the era even more so and kind of engage with it because you're kind of you're getting used to and learning to love such a wide variety of characters, whether it's the Brigadier, Mike Yates, Sergeant Benton, all these great classic characters that even 50 years since this era was on, we all still love them. And so I think that for me is why it's such a sort of endearing era of the show. It was an era where Derek Sherwin, just before it started, had the money-saving idea of let's put the Doctor on Earth, and then left after the first story of the Pertwee era, and left it up to Barry Letts and Terrance Dicks trying to kind of figure out how do we suddenly do Doctor Who when we've got this massive limitation of only being able to do it on Earth. and they just come up with so many creative ideas. You've got all parallel universe stories. You've got your alien invasion story, like Spared from Space. You've got a mad scientist in Inferno, but then you've got a parallel universe, or you've got Silurians, where the whole storyline is the aliens were here in the first place, and you're invading the aliens in that sense. So it was like they just seemed to find a way to tell innovative stories, because they had to, because it wasn't easy. You couldn't just go off to a planet and have an alien trying to take over another planet, or end up on a spaceship and having a base under siege story. You couldn't do that anymore. And so they had to find better ways of telling stories in Doctor Who. And I think that's why this era just, benefited so much from that. And, there's so many great writers involved in it as well. But anyway, that's just a bit of stuff.
Yeah, I probably couldn't have put it better myself. I feel like, looking back, researching from what people thought of the show in 1968, 1969, 1970, I feel obviously the Troughton era towards the end, sadly, didn't really perform amazingly. Like, episodes of the War Games dipped below 4 million, which had never been seen before, and are only really comparable to the end of the McCoy era and now, really. So absolutely. I feel it did need like a fresh start, and I've seen things from back in the day of people being a bit skeptical about the whole new thing. No one was skeptical about Pertwee. I feel everyone thought he was going to be very good, but the concept of like the Doctor working for the military, it sounds a bit weird, and like, this isn't really going to work. But I think it's amazing that they did. Like you said, they found some really creative concepts. Like, as you were saying, I was going to mention the Silurians. Obviously, they were here in the first place. Same with the Sea Devils. And we've got the Master, who is like a proper recurring villain, who's from the Doctor's own race. And obviously, I'm pretty sure everyone who's seen the classics, or the vast majority, do think Delgado is the best, or at least one of the best Masters. He's fantastic.
Yeah, I would think so. I'd say he's certainly my favorite Master. I think maybe Missy and Dewan's Masters are up there, but I think certainly when you've got the classic series, Delgado is completely unparalleled. Like his suave performance to just walk into a room and just even from his first story where he's running the plastics factory in Terror of the Autons, and just when he stares at you with those evil eyes and says, "You will obey me," it's brilliant. I love his incarnation.
Yeah, I feel even characters in the era like Pertwee, like, I feel he doesn't really come into his own as the Doctor he's known for until maybe Inferno. Not to say he was bad before that, but he became the proper action hero in that story. And whereas Delgado, from his first scene, he knows who he's playing, and he plays the same character until Frontier in Space episode 6. So it's pretty amazing. So we might as well get started now. We've had an overall discussion on the era of some of the stories that we just like and dislike. We're going to save our number one favorite and least favorite until the end. So Elliot, why don't you start us off? Give us a story. Let's start on a positive note. One of your favorites.
Sure, great. Because I am a bit of a Doctor Who nerd, and I've been watching the classic series, I actually have a spreadsheet where I rank all of the episodes. And it's really handy because I've already done the whole Pertwee era in my marathon. So I've got up here my rankings for every single Pertwee story, which is really very helpful. I mean, I think I'm a fairly forgiving fan usually. But essentially, there's only one story that I have that ranks less than a 7 out of 10 on my my rankings. So generally, I think the consistency and quality of the Pertwee is very, very high. Picking a random one that I think is right up there. Wouldn't be my absolute favorite, but it's right up there. Let's go for the Green Death. That's a classic, isn't it? Like, it's such a we go off to good old Wales. It just sort of feels like one of the last classic unit stories. Season 11, sure, there's a couple in there. You've got Invasion of the Dinosaurs and you've got Planet of the Spiders, but this really feels like the last proper story where you've got the whole unit family firing on all cylinders. You've got the Doctor and Joe, the kind of classic Doctor companion duo of this era. Obviously Joe's last story, which brings out a great performance as well. You've obviously got all the kind of ecological background to this story, and some of the Barry Lett's desire to get that into the show, and discussing how we're destroying the planet and everything. And it's just such a well crafted story. It's such it really, I think, goes along at quite a good pace throughout it, despite being a 6-parter, and, 6-parters inevitably are often full of padding. But I don't feel like the Green Death suffers from that as much as some other stories. Like, I feel like I'm always gradually learning more about it. We we learn about the maggots and quite what's going on, why all these radioactive maggots and things. And then obviously we find out about Boss and the company and all of that just gradually builds up and plays into it. And it's really well crafted from that point of view. But alongside that, you're kind of playing out this narrative of Jo, gradually deciding she doesn't want to do this with the Doctor anymore. And, she's falling in love with somebody else. And just that just, Classic Who isn't always the best at romance. Let's be honest. They didn't always know quite how to do that, and also how to get rid of companions. Look at Invasion of Time. That wasn't their greatest move with Leela. But I feel like with this, they at least kind of interweaved it through the whole of this story, the 6-part serial, really, really effectively. Building up the relationship between her and what's his name? What's his name again?
Hang on, let me look it up.
Cliff, something like that. I was really bad. I haven't seen it in a couple of years.
Yeah.
I really should know his name, shouldn't I?
And fun factoid, I believe that the guy who played him was actually Katie Manning's partner at the time, which is quite interesting.
Clifford Jones, I've just found it. Yes. Yes, Stuart Bevan, the actor. Well, yeah, he was indeed going out with Katie Manning at the time, which I guess probably helped their sort of on-screen chemistry as well in that sense. Being able to create a believable kind of romance plotline through that. So, I thought that was a great aspect of this story, and just it's full of action scenes. You've got the Doctor and Bessie back out again as always. Like, it just feels like Planet of the Spiders is a story that kind of ticks all the boxes in the same way, but just doesn't do it very well, and isn't as good a fundamental story. The budget is really lacking, and it's clear. Whereas in this, apart from there's that sort of kind of flying insect creature at one point, I think, in this story that looks pretty awful. But apart from that, it's actually looks pretty reasonable budget. Obviously, the actual sort of chemical factory looks pretty impressive. Using obviously a location for that. I think that all works fairly well. And it's just a story that I have a lot of nostalgia for. I think I must have first watched it around Christmas time when I was very young. And so for some reason, I associate with the story with Christmas, even though it wasn't airing around Christmas and there's nothing to do with Christmas. I think it's just because of the fact that I watched it around that time that it really adds that extra bit of, nostalgia to me for it, which is always really, really fun. Let's just rattle off a couple of other ones that I really like while we're at it. The Sea Devils, I might as well mention that, seeing as there's the Sea Devils are returning. It's I think in a video about 5 or 6 years ago on my channel, I did put this as my number one favorite Pertwee story. I don't quite now. I put it at number 2 or 3 or 4, probably something like that, right up there. I just although this is in some ways a bit atypical because it doesn't involve UNIT. Obviously, you kind of have the Navy basically taking on the role of UNIT for a story, which I think works perfectly fine because of the setting of it. Obviously, being out at sea, out underwater, and sure, the Sea Devils, I guess, as a story, is to an extent a retread of the Silurians because it's that same idea of we were here first, we want our planet back. The Doctor trying to negotiate a peace treaty. But obviously in this story, it's the Master who's trying to kind of, make that all go wrong. It's a nice bit of continuity that we start this story with him in the prison, having been arrested at the end of season 8 in the Demons. Like it's just nice that Doctor actually thought about the continuity of that at points, and so we get the Doctor visiting the Master in prison. And then we also obviously find out that the Master is running the prison that he's in because he's the Master, he takes over and then utilizing the people there to try and, get in league with the Sea Devils, basically bring them up out of the sea and get in league with them. It's such great fun stuff. And, the iconic scenes of the Sea Devils coming out of the water. I can hope we get something like that in Legends of the Sea Devils around Easter time this year. I'd really like to see something like that, just harking back to that one of the most iconic classic Who shots, I think, really. Of all those scenes, that I think it's the episode 3 cliffhanger, I think it might be, where they just all rise up out of the water, and then after you've got them chasing the Doctor and Jo across a minefield and things like that, it's really, really great stuff, I think. So that's another cracking one. I think the locations of that really, really help. It's in many ways very rare to have a Doctor Who story kind of set in the ocean, in the sea, in large part, and to actually use location for that, because sure, we get stories like that, but usually they're on like an underwater base or an underwater cruiser or something, and you don't actually see any of the exterior apart from model shots. So to actually see them on boats out in the sea and stuff is I think it's just such a great scale to it as well, which is really, really impressive.
I feel I was just going to say about the Sea Devils, I feel Sea Devils is like a better done Doctor Who than Silurians. I feel Silurians is good, but I feel that it's probably my least favorite of season 7. I feel that it's very, very dragged out, but maybe not in as much of an effective way as maybe Ambassadors of Death or something. But I don't know, the Sea Devils is just sort of, obviously there's more like atmospheric and intense because they're on the ocean, and obviously,
Yeah.
it's more claustrophobic. But at the same time, we've got the Master as well, who is just, you can't really go wrong with him in the story.
Yeah.
He never makes
absolutely.
the story worse. As well as, I don't know, it's just a bit more action packed as well. Like we get loads of like Sea Devil action and things, whereas I don't know, I feel Doctor Who and the Silurians was a bit more. It felt like a bit more of a Troughton story in terms of a base under siege, if anything. But yeah, I do really love the Sea Devils and Green Death as well. What you were saying, I feel it's quite sad, really, because not just because of Joe's exit at the end, and obviously the very like moody shots of the Third Doctor's car, like in the sunset. It's really cool. Besides that, it's really sad just because it's sort of a last hurrah for Unit, as you said. It's like, although there was Unit in seasons 11, 12, and 13, I feel not that they declined in quality, but it just became less prevalent. And I don't know, I feel, although the Pertwee era obviously ended in Planet of the Spiders, I feel Green Death was properly the end of that era. So, what were you going to say for your third really good story?
Yeah, I mean, well, just picking up off the back of that, I think you're right to say that the Green Death feels like kind of an end of an era. Obviously, we've earlier in that season lost Roger Delgado, so he's no longer part of the show. Then you lose Joe as well, and Katie Manning's character. And I think that's the point when John obviously decided he wanted to move on as well. And as good as it was seeing John alongside Liz Sladen in season 11, it just doesn't feel like the Pertwee era in quite the same way. As you say, you've got a couple of the Unit stories which are still solid, like Invasion of the Dinosaurs, barring the dinosaurs, is pretty good. And even if Planet of the Spiders isn't so much, but I think that as we say, Green Death is really kind of the end of an era there, and everybody's starting to move on in the following season. But in terms of other stories that are let me pick out a couple of just really in the middle stories that aren't bad, aren't good, are just like, they're just there, like Terror of the Autons. I enjoy it. It's pretty solid. Like, it's just a classic kind of obviously it's the Master's introductory story. There's a few good concepts in there, a few, creepy bit of horror with the sort of troll doll thing as well, and the chair that eats the guy as well. That's, that sort of stuff is quite good sort of horror aspects that are added into it. And the Master's great, establishing him as a character. And it's just kind of good. I don't think it's as good as the previous Auton story, Spear from Space. I think that's the sort of peak of the Autons there. But it's just kind of, I can sit down and watch it. It's a fun hour and a half, if nothing absolutely special or groundbreaking. It just is kind of the sort of typical story of the era, really. It's probably how I'd look at it. And I'd probably say much the same of a story like Claws of Axos as well. I know some people quite like the Claws of Axos, and I by no means think it's bad. It's just kind of another one of those kind of fairly average 4-part Unit stories, with a cool looking villain. The Axons look really cool, both the sort of tentacly version and the sort of golden version. Obviously the tentacly version becomes the Chronoid in Seas of Doom. And those look really, really cool. And you've got Bill Filer in it, and you've got the Master in it, and it's, there's some good characters in there, and you've got the Unit family involved, and it just is, a lot of what season 8 is really. I kind of look at season 8, and no story is bad in it, but also no story is an absolute classic, in my opinion. I think the Demons is probably the closest to that. The Demons is very, very good, but that sort of feels like the kind of, if you think of the Pertwee era, you're probably thinking about season 8. A story from season 8 is probably, where it really sits, and what you would always imagine it to be, which is, a Unit story with an alien invasion of Earth type vibes, which is what we get in Claws of Axos to an extent. Well, yeah, essentially in Claws of Axos, with the Axonite being, sent in to kind of start off the invasion, basically, and obviously in Terror of the Autons as well. Pick out another classic that isn't number one, but is a classic. I would say Inferno. I'm not going to put that number one, which, I'm sure some people would put that as their greatest story, but it's 9 out of 10. It's top tier Doctor Who. Like, it still absolutely is. It's, I just, those 7-part story, the whole of season 7 is probably my favorite season of the classic series anyway. And Inferno, it's kind of the first time that they properly do a parallel universe in Doctor Who. I don't think we've up to that point we really see it in any significant way, and it's just a great way to tell a story where You want to feel the high stakes of it, because you introduce a parallel universe, which means you can then destroy that parallel universe. And whereas in so many stories, you've got to stop the countdown at 1 when the Earth's about to blow up or something. You know, it's always that dramatic moment. 5, 4, 3, oh, they click the button and it stops. But with Inferno, they just destroy the Earth. You know, the lava sort of comes up from underneath the Earth, doesn't it, and just starts destroying it, and all the people die, and that's it. You know, everybody's dead in that parallel universe. And that's great to really give us the stakes that we need to kind of feel that the main characters are in some sense of danger, which just isn't always there when, well, they can't destroy the Earth. So eventually it'll have to be resolved. So I think that as a concept works really, really well. You have brilliant performances from, Nick Courtney playing the brigade leader, the villainous brigade leader, who, he never, and just his kind of descending into almost madness of not being able to cope with the situation of, wielding a gun and just trying to make stuff happen because he's a military man, without a care in the world for anybody else except himself to try and survive. And just seeing him descend to that point through the sort of parallel universe parts of the story is fascinating, I think, alongside Caroline John playing, I can't remember what the name of the person is, but she plays like a scientist, sort of military commander, doesn't she? Because she plays a scientist in the real universe, but she plays like a military person, doesn't she? Yeah. And she's also a really, really great character, I think, across both the normal version and the parallel universe version. And so just as that plays out, despite it being 7 episodes long, which it's a very long time and can feel padded in places, I think this is definitely one of the better ones in avoiding going around in circles. By using that parallel universe, you can kind of cover some of the similar ground, but do it in a very different way, because you can kind of have anything happen in a parallel universe. You can have anybody die, you can have anything happen to the universe. And so I just think the way they explored that in creating a sort of almost like Soviet Russia style sort of England that is in this alternative universe is just really, really interesting, and just leads us to such confusion as to what's happening early on in the story when the Doctor gets transported over into the parallel universe, and you're like, this doesn't seem quite right. What's going on? Obviously, if you've seen it before, you know what's going on. But for the fresh audience to just trying to follow and start to understand what's going on, and obviously to be a consequence of the Doctor's actions essentially in trying to fix the TARDIS, which ultimately sends him off into the parallel universe and messes everything up. But you could say also then saves the universe because he sees how it all plays out to be able to stop it when he comes back into the normal universe. So I just think it's a great story. Professor Starman's a great villain as well, descending into the primord madness that he ends up in. I mean, I'm not sure the Primords are the greatest costume and makeup Doctor has ever done, but they did it, and it serves its purpose of sort of being a created villain through the kind of gooey liquid stuff that's coming up out of the drilling there. So I don't know. I just think that story is just it's quite kind of heavy and quite grim, I guess, in some ways, but it's just such a brilliantly well-told story, well-performed story. There's a lot of problems behind the scenes when the director just collapsed during filming of it, and he had to be taken to hospital, and Barry Letts had to step in at the last minute and direct the rest of it, and yet somehow keep it having the feel of what had already been done. I think it was Douglas Camfield, wasn't it, who directed the story, and so that all works so brilliantly as well. So yeah, Inferno is a classic.
Yeah, absolutely. I've actually got like a list of I've seen 22 Pertwee stories, all of them besides the Mutants and Invasion of the Dinosaurs. And I have Inferno as 3rd. And what else were you saying? I've got Terror of the Autons as 12th, so almost in the middle there. Yeah, Inferno is just fantastic. I saw an interesting theory the other day. And what if Inferno was entirely set on a parallel universe until a few minutes before the end of the last episode? So if the entire time you thought that this was the parallel universe and the characters were largely the same, the entire Earth gets destroyed, the Doctor dies, and then it shifts, and we go back to the real universe for the last few minutes.
That would be really cool.
That'd be fantastic, I think, and just would leave viewers in such shock, like, oh my God, what just happened? They killed off everyone. It'd be pretty interesting. And yeah, what you were saying, season 8, I feel I like season 8 a bit more than most. Like, it is quite generic, but I don't know. I feel Claws of Axos, I feel that's very middling. Same with Colony in Space, but I feel Mind of Evil and the Demons are really, really great stories that I feel push this not quite to the level of season 7, but definitely getting there. I feel season 7 just has that very dark, gritty feel that I feel is never really replicated in Doctor Who ever again for any long period of time. I feel it's just a very unique season of the program, and it's probably like my third, fourth favorite season of classic Doctor Who. I'd say maybe things like season 10, season 16 are a tiny bit better.
Okay.
Which leads me to another one that I think is really good in season 10, Carnival of Monsters.
Oh, yeah, I should have mentioned that one. Yeah, of course, we've kind of been focusing more on the unit stories, but obviously there are a few in there this is straight after the Three Doctors, where the Doctor is finally allowed off Earth because he's got his chameleon circuit back, which is great. And so it feels I think it almost makes it feel fresh to actually be in a story that isn't set on Earth anymore. And obviously this, fascinating idea of getting stuck in a miniscope in Carnival of Monsters and, meeting these dinosaurs, almost getting stuck in a time loop, as, very prevalent given Eve of the Daleks recently. So I think that's a really, really fun aspect of it. And them trying to break out of the different aspects of the miniscope is just a really, as a kid, it's such a fun and fascinating idea that breaking through these walls that should be something, you know what you're expecting to be when you break through that wall, but then it's something completely different because actually that isn't, there's nothing behind that. That's part of the machine that's behind it, and they're crawling around inside there. So that sort of stuff is really, I think, a load of fun. Obviously the Drashigs as well, a fun little villain to have, a little alien monster to scare you with, basically. But yeah, I think it's a cracker of a story, personally.
Yeah, I feel it's in a way, I don't know if anyone else thought this. I might be being really stupid and weird here, but I did think while watching this, it's a bit like the series 1 episode Bad Wolf in a way, because they're all in these separate TV shows similar to the the miniscope environments. I just feel, I don't know, it's a bit of a, not quite a parallel, because obviously we don't have the Daleks at the end and everything, although we do at the end of the next story. It's just a really fun one. I feel it has this really creative, childlike almost imagination to it. I feel this could have been like a Graham Williams story or something. So that's my second favorite Pertwee story. I feel it's really fantastic. And another one, The Curse of Pelodon.
The Curse of Pelodon. That's I can never quite decide where I stand with the Pelodon stories. Monster is definitely the weaker of the two. That one just kind of drags out to oblivion. Obviously, Curse of Paladin is very much about Brexit, frankly. There's a lot of political, because obviously it was around the time that Britain were deciding whether they were going to join the EU. Oh, how far we've come. But it's one of those, as we say, few stories from the earlier seasons of Pertwee where he does get to go off Earth, thrust into this adventure on the planet Pelodon. I think it's one of the great things about it is that we see, it shows how it makes the Doctor universe feel bigger, because you see all these different aliens. You don't just go to a planet where there's one type of alien. There's 5 different aliens, the delegates from these different planets who've turned up on Pelodon and everything like that. I think that's a really creative thing that Doctor, certainly in the classic series, often almost just forgot to do, thinking, oh wait, maybe there would be multiple different races turning up on these planets from different places and things like that. And that's something that plays out really, really effectively in the story of Alpha Centauri, the Ice Warriors, and the interesting twist that ultimately the Ice Warriors aren't really the villains of this story at all. Which, that's just really, really interesting that you bring in an alien that is a scary monster, and that should be the villain is actually not. That's just a great way to kind of subvert the audience's expectations, I think. So I wouldn't say it's one of my absolute favorites. It's kind of, for me, a bit middling, but I still, I think it's a pretty good one.
I feel the thing that really annoys me about Curse of Pelodon is that I know it's going to be entirely retconned in the Monster of Pelodon when it turns out they are the bad guys, and it just sort of ruins it a bit for me.
That is true.
Now we're talking about that, and we're about halfway through. We might as well get onto stories that aren't maybe necessarily all that terrible, but just the weaker ones of this era. So I might as well start us off with the Monster of Pelodon. I feel it's just a very unworthy sequel to Curse of Pelodon. As much as I loved Curse of Pelodon, it's probably 4th or 5th for me in this era. Monster of Pelodon spent 4 episodes being basically just 3 or 4 episodes being basically just a rehash of Curse of Pelodon, but slightly different. And then the last 3 episodes, it was just like Ice Warriors. It was just like a really generic runaround. I feel it wasn't dissimilar structure-wise from what is it, Invasion of Time, where the monsters just sort of introduced at the end, and then it's just a really boring runaround, which sort of makes the first few episodes just seem really pointless and weakens them a bit. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, again, this is a story that's quite politically charged in the sense that it focuses on the miners' strike of the sort of early 70s, and that was sort of the background to this story of the time. There's some interesting features on the DVDs and Blu-rays about it. But yeah, Monster of Pelodon is a story that I just find really boring. It's probably there's in Doctor Who, I can look past a dodgy special effect. I can look past a bit of a plot hole. But when something is just really slow and boring, like Monster of Pelodon is, it drags. It just goes on and on and on. Why is it 6 parts? I don't know. As you say, it's just a bit of a runaround. It's very, very kind of a straightforward story. Again, it's not my absolute worst of the Pertwee era, but it's not a story I'm ever going to revisit outside of a marathon. I'm never going to think, I feel like watching the Monster of Pelodon today. You've got Curse, which is quite good. But then the monster just feels like a really poor sequel to it. I just can't describe how it's just really boring. I don't have much more to say about it apart from it's just there's nothing particularly exciting that happens here. Obviously, you've got Agador back in it again, and isn't he ultimately part of like defeating them at the end or something? Like the Doctor takes control of Agador or something, doesn't he, and defeats them that way, something like that. And then you've got the Queen, obviously taking over at the end. You get a good moment with Sarah Jane saying, talking to the Queen and saying, there's nothing only about being a woman, and that is a good moment. But it's kind of like that's the only moment anybody would ever remember this story for, because it's just so unmemorable. And obviously it's got all the same, sets and designs to Curse of Pelodon, much the same, the same buildings, the same interiors, some of the same sort of caves and things, that the imagery all just blurs into one. And so there's nothing distinctive about Monster over Curse of Pelodon. So yeah, I do not have anything particularly good to say about it. It's nothing, it's not awful. It's not like offensively bad or the worst thing that they've ever done. It's just pretty boring.
So I'm gonna save obviously my number one least favorite till later, but another one that I feel I'm gonna get like cancelled or something for this because it's a very unpopular opinion. I do not dislike this story. I just think it's a bit of a meh, very overrated one. That's the Three Doctors.
Okay.
I know, a bit of an unpopular one. I just feel, although Troughton is fantastic, I really love the second Doctor. They're my two favorite Doctors, interacting with some pretty good like banter and things like that. It's fantastic, but I feel it feels a bit like a pantomime, sort of like the unit headquarters has been transported. Now we're in this really glittery set, and there's a couple of episodes, and the whole thing with Omega, like he willed himself into existence again. It feels a bit like a sort of pantomime that is loosely based off Doctor Who rather than an actual competent story. That said, there are really good parts about it. Again, it was the first, technically it's the only every Doctor there has been so far of Doctor Who, because obviously 5 Doctors, it was basically 3.5 Doctors, and then
it's a 3.5.
Day of the Doctors was the 2.5 Doctors, with the rest having little bits, But this was the only every Doctor ever episode. And I feel this, like, the stakes are really high, and obviously we've got the Time Lords, we've got Omega, and it's just a really cool, like, epic episode. But I feel it's let down by its execution, really. What do you think?
Yeah, the Three Doctors, I think it gets a higher regard for the name of it and its concepts than actually sitting down and watching it. I'm not saying it's not fun, and it's great to see the second and third Doctors playing off against each other, getting a bit annoyed with each other, and that's is a good bit of comedy and a good bit of fun in that there. Obviously, of course, it's a real shame that William Hartnell couldn't be more involved in the story, and it's great to see him, but it also really shows that he was pretty unwell at that time, and really couldn't do anything apart from read lines off a piece of card held in front of him. So although it is, as you say, technically the Three Doctors, it still feels more like the Two Doctors, because there's only really 2 Doctors doing anything apart from 3 or 4 minutes of dialogue from the first Doctor. So I like Omega as a villain, and I don't think it's a bad story for it. I just don't think, whereas the Five Doctors really does feel like nostalgia fest. It's full of, returning companions and monsters and doctors, and it feels really just fun and celebratory. It's the Five Doctors, whereas this just feels like almost like an episode, just a Doctor Who story of its time that happens to also have another Doctor in it. I think it doesn't feel like as much of a departure from the current show as what the Five Doctors did. In much the same way that like the Two Doctors also was kind of just another Doctor Who story with an extra Doctor thrown into it, but then that wasn't meant to be really celebratory at all. It was just, let's have two Doctors in the story. And I just think that's what the Three Doctors feels more like. Maybe, if we were in our 50s now and we watched Three Doctors when we were young, then maybe we would appreciate it more. And I totally understand that perspective as well. We all have nostalgia for stories from our childhood, and I'm sure I rate Series 1 higher than somebody who didn't watch it at the time. But yeah, the Three Doctors isn't a story that I get particularly, it's almost, because I remember the last time I watched it, I was really looking forward to watching it, because I'm like, it's the Three Doctors, it's, multi-Doctor story, it's going to be great. And you watch it and you're just kind of like, it's okay. It's pretty solid. It's just a solid story in there. Omega's a great villain. It's nice to see the whole unit family, the Brigadier, and thinking they're in Chroma when they get the unit base transported to the quarry and all of that. There's some really fun stuff in it, but fundamentally, it does just feel like another Doctor Who story with an extra Doctor in it. And it's a Bob Baker and Dave Martin story, so it's probably not going to be absolute top tier, but also not going to be terrible.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I feel well, I don't consider this a bad story. I feel there's only one story in this era that obviously we'll get onto later that I consider bad. Okay. But yeah, it's a bit of an overrated one. So yeah. Before we get on to our number one favorite and least favorite for this era, let's sorry, I can't really speak. What's one more of your not necessarily disliked, but just lower down stories?
Yeah, a story that I think is one that kind of just, it's not a unit story, but one that I don't think is particularly great, but also, I can't say it's terrible, is Planet of the Daleks. Now, Planet of the Daleks does feel like, many people have said it before, but it's still true, it's Terry Nation's greatest hits. It's him writing in all the same ideas that he's done in his previous 4 or 5 Dalek stories back in the 60s. And, he's got a radioactive poison in it, I think at one point, hasn't it? You've got the invisible creatures. You obviously got a load of Daleks on Skaro. Or was it on Spyrodon? I can't remember where it says. Is it on Spyrodon?
Spyrodon, yeah.
Spyrodon, that's it. Yes, not actually Skaro, is it? No, but it's kind of retreading some of the same stuff of the Daleks, of the original The Dalek story, but on Spyrodon. It's nice to have something different in the era to just unit stories, but it's not like we went for something different to have a great story. We kind of went with it, and this is much the problem with a lot of the Dalek stories of the Pertwee era. None of them are particularly classic. I think Day of the Daleks is better. Death of the Daleks is definitely worse. But Planet of the Daleks is just this kind of average, middling story that felt like, it's got the Daleks in, so it must be exciting. But it just isn't very exciting. And, they play the episode 1 cliffhanger is the Doctor rubbing away on some rock and seeing like an outline of a Dalek or something. And it's like, why are you playing a Dalek reveal as your cliffhanger if it's called Planet of the Daleks? That doesn't really, there's not really any point to that. And, there's a lot of runarounds and things, getting trapped, trying to escape, the usual sort of stuff that, pads out a 6-part Doctor Who story. Probably people remember this most for the line of dialogue from the Doctor where he says, courage isn't a matter of being frightened, or not being frightened, it's being afraid and doing what you have to do anyway, which is a great quote, but there's not a lot else that's memorable from this story. There's the Dalek with the torch for the eye stalk that is really, it looks a lot like a torch, I can't deny it, which is a real shame. But yeah, it's just kind of there again. It's just one of those more average ones. It's not terrible. Like, none of this era really is particularly terrible. It's just in the lower echelons. And when you've got Frontier in Space before it, which I think is a great story, I think Frontier in Space is a cracker of a story. I know there's a lot of escape capture runarounds in it, but the Draconians are brilliant. And, I just thoroughly enjoy all the sort of space opera style feel to it. The Dalek stunning from the last episode is great. And obviously the Master throughout is brilliant as well. Such a shame it's his last appearance for Roger Delgado. But then you just play into Planet of the Spiders, which isn't on a Planet of the Daleks, sorry, which isn't particularly great. And then you've got the Green Death after it, which is brilliant. So it kind of gets lost in the midst of those two stories, I think. Well, that whole season, really, because you've got Three Doctors and Carnival of Monsters as the other ones, which are also, Three Doctors is kind of good and Carnival of Monsters is great. So, yeah, I think it's a story that gets lost in that season, and kind of rightly so, because it isn't particularly great.
Yeah, I feel there's one story in every season that's just not necessarily the worst, but it just kind of gets lost a bit. Like, people don't really remember that season for it. Like, obviously, we've got Planet of the Daleks, probably Death to the Daleks, to be honest. We've got season 8, we've got Colony in Space. Season 7, probably Ambassadors of Death. Even though I love Ambassadors of Death, probably more so than Spearhead from Space and Silurians. Not many people seem to remember it as much. But yeah, we always have one per season that's just kind of there that no one really talks about, perhaps enough. So we might as well move on to, the big segment at the end, which is our number one least favorite and favorite episode for that era. We've had some very interesting conversations for the Hartnell and Troughton era discussions.
Okay. Can I ask, what was your? I haven't heard them. So, what was your favorite and your least favorites for the Hartnell and Troughton era, just really quickly?
So my least favorite for the Hartnell era was The Rescue, which was very controversial to Jamie.
I think it's all right. It's not great, but it's got a twist. Something. Anyway, sorry, this isn't a Hartnell podcast.
My favorite was The Keys of Marinus, which that's a bit of a divisive story sometimes. But my least favorite for Troughton was The Dominators, which is pretty common.
Fair enough. Yeah.
And my favorite was The War Games, which Bill also agreed with.
I would tend to go that way as well. Probably, War Games would be top tier there. Yeah. Okay, cool.
So we've done enough negativity. So Elliot, why don't you start us off with your number one favorite Third Doctor story?
It's a funny one because you just talked about this story in your slightly average one. Ambassadors of Death is my favorite Pertwee era story. Now, I know many people look at it as the kind of, least good one of season 7. I mean, season 7 has 4 of my favorite Doctor Who stories ever. Like, they're all in my kind of, would be in my top 15 probably of all time Doctor Who. But Ambassadors, it just ticks all the boxes for me. I can't praise it enough. It's such a wide-ranging story. I think, we start with these scenes of this mysterious spaceship that's being broadcast onto television, of him trying to dock with another spaceship that they've lost contact with. And, we end up with the Doctor going up into space in a sort of, standard rocket craft, through all sort of sabotage, secret killings of people. You never know quite if somebody's a good or a baddie throughout the story. And ultimately, most of them turn out to be baddies, frankly. And it just feels, the action sequences are some of the best things I've ever seen in Doctor Who in this story. When, I think it's the Mars probe, isn't it, that comes back down onto Earth, and then UNIT are trying to look after it, and then they come and get ambushed by all of the crew. Like, they've got helicopters, you've got people flying off motorbikes, you've got shooting explosions. It's crazy. Like, I love that stuff. It really feels like the pinnacle of the kind of Unity era from the point of view of action, the sort of action hero John Pertwee Doctor, and the action sequences throughout it. Like, I just feel like this is the absolute pinnacle of that, really, that we see in this story. Just the amount of action filled with it. Some great cliffhangers, when they have the recovery unit back down on Earth, and the Doctor's talking on the communicator, and he suddenly starts realizing that these are automated messages, recorded messages, and then he's like, right, cut it open, and it cuts the sting. It's so exciting, getting Liz Shaw being chased around and falling off the bridge and seemingly going to fall into the water and stuff. Like, there's just so much to love about it. I love the framing of sort of broadcasting it all on television as well, which is just a really fun idea. To kind of having that, watching a report on television or watching it live on TV of this docking of these spaceships, and then it obviously all going wrong and UNIT getting involved, is just so much fun as well. And just the real mystery around it as well, about who the ambassadors are, where are they from? And when we get that moment in, I think it's episode 5 or 6, when the Doctor eventually does get up into space, docks with the craft, and kind of meets, yes, we don't really see them ever properly, but meets the people behind the ambassadors. And we find out that ultimately, they're not bad guys, really. they've just sort of been stolen and, you know, sort of turned bad by General Carrington, and who'd gone up into space previously. And, you know, seeing these astronauts suddenly who think they're down on Earth, and, you know, watching a football match, and actually they're up in a space station, don't know what's going on. Like, just the way this plays out with such mystery, I just find absolutely fascinating. It really feels like it's just, you know, winding here, there, and everywhere, seeing, you know, the ambassadors breaking into banks, breaking into different facilities and stuff with such just touch you and you'll just, you know, explode and die, basically, is, you know, a real threat to it as well. So yeah, it's a story I absolutely adore. I think the score to it's fantastic as well. The theme, the musical theme for the ambassadors is brilliant. Yeah, given the kind of problems in putting this story together, the fact that there was about 6 different writers for it, it was originally meant to be a Troughton story. Like, it works. It fits so effectively into the era, and I just get so much enjoyment out of this story as a whole. I really think it's an absolute classic Doctor Who story. I know a lot of fans, you know, no one really. I think maybe 10 years ago, when, you know, before it came out on DVD and people were less aware of it, I feel like people were kind of thought, oh, well, that's kind of the dodgy one of season 7. I feel like now people at least are like, yeah, it's pretty good. But for me, I think it's absolutely top tier.
Yeah, absolutely. While it isn't my favorite, which I'm quite glad about, because then we have something, you know, a different story to talk about.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's my favorite. Yeah, this is a really, really good one. I think it's not even top 5. It's probably like 6th or 7th, maybe. But even then, it's still like really, really good. I feel it's interesting how it shows, you know, it's not these generic aliens like we've had in the Troughton and Hartnell eras. It's humans are shown as the villains lots of the time, and it's showing how humans are greedy and are exploiting these aliens for their power. It's really, really interesting. And like you said about like just the whole mystery behind it. This was one of the first ever classics I watched. I got this when I was 12 or 13. I was very late to the party with classic Doctor Who, but I got this one, and I did not appreciate it nearly as much because I was still like on a diet of New Who and did not appreciate classics as much. But
it's quite long. I'll give you that. At least it is, you know, nearly 3 hours long. So I'm sure, you know, watching that when you're a bit younger, I think it is, can just be a bit of a drag. Yeah,
and but now I watched this about a year ago, and I appreciated it so much more. It's and the action scenes as well. Like, the action does dwindle out a little bit towards the end, but pretty much the first 4 episodes each have their own big action sequence. We've got the warehouse. We've got, obviously, when they're intercepting the space.
I forgot that great scene in the warehouse in episode 1. That's brilliant, isn't it? So, you know, all those shoots out there. It's great fun.
I do find it quite amusing how it's not actually shown many enemies, but the amount of shots makes it seem like, you know, that they have like stormtrooper aim.
True.
Of the Daleks. But then again, it makes for good action, you know. So yeah, Ambassadors of Death is a really good one. So we don't completely end this on a really negative note by doing 2 bad stories. I might as well go to my least favorite now.
Okay.
This is going to be quite a generic one, really. The Time Monster. Yeah, it's not great. I feel I do quite like the mythological aspects of it. Like, we've got Kronos, and obviously when we go back in time, and we've got you know, Atlantis and everything. That whole last episode, I think, was actually a really interesting one, where Atlantis was like collapsing, and it was really, really cool. But they have about 3 episodes where they're just sort of, you know, at that research center messing around with time stuff, while units just sort of standing still, you know, because of the time experiments. It just this could have been such a great 4-parter. I feel I say this about the vast majority of 6-parters, but it's true. It could have been so much better if they'd chopped 2 episodes off from, let's say, episodes 2 and 3, and we get some really weird scenes as well. Like, there's one scene where Benton gets like turned into a baby and then back again. That's really weird.
It's interesting, isn't it?
Yeah, we get some really weird ones. Although I do quite like just it's very a classic unit story. Like, you know, from the premise, you can't really go very wrong with it, if you know what I mean. Like, it's very much just them capitalizing off the success of the demons, because it's basically the same thing, really. The Unicaster are involved. There's the Master. He's trying to resurrect a demon. You know, it's the same thing. What do you think?
Yeah, the Time Monster is not a story that I have much affinity for it. It's not my number one least favorite. I think it'd probably be about third or fourth worst, probably, the Pertwee era. We'll come on to my least favorite in a minute, but yeah, it's pretty boring for a lot of the episodes. I mean, I don't have a great interest in, sort of mythology and Greek mythology and anything like that. And so stories that lay heavily into that don't really do that much for me for that reason. And as you say, this story does just feel like a bit of a waiting game. You have the Doctor making this slightly pointless, creation with like bottles and, just that bizarre thing. You've obviously got the very interesting looking Tomtit device as well, which is just rather questionable. And I don't know, it's got the Master in it, which always helps it a little bit, and there's a few classic scenes of the Master, taking over a research station, the usual stuff the Master does, but without anything particularly, distinctive about it or particularly groundbreaking about it. Him just trying to work out how to utilize this machine for his own devices and stuff. There's some cool shots where you've got like the soldiers turning up in the fields and the bomb that's going to be dropped on unit and stuff like that. That stuff's quite fun. Bringing stuff from different time periods and things. That's quite a cool idea. And as you say, the stuff in Atlantis towards, I think it's I can't remember if it's just episode 6 or episode 5 of the 6. I can't remember, but
I feel that's like halfway through episode 5 they go to there.
Yeah, when they get there, then it gets eminently more interesting. Frankly, having that different setting, having the mystery and the mythos of Atlantis, I think is really, really interesting. But as a whole story, I sit there, I watch it, and I don't, it's just not a concept that generally particularly interests me, and just feels fairly kind of bog standard of the era that it's in, I think.
Yeah, I feel I don't really blame you for disliking the mythology stories, considering the other ones we have, Underworld and the Horns of Nymon. So
they're the most obvious ones, and they are. Well, the Horns of Nymon, I enjoy it for the ridiculous performances, but yes, as a story, it's lacking. And Underworld is, well, that's for another podcast.
I can probably guess from little things you've said in this podcast so far, what your least favorite is. So why don't you go ahead, Elliot?
My least favorite is the Mutants.
Oh,
so that's what you thought it was going to be, or do you think it was going to be Death to the Daleks?
Yeah, I thought it'd be Death to the Daleks.
Death to the Daleks is number 2. So pretty close. It's not good. That's not a good story. Anyway, the Mutants. The last time I watched it, it was just thoroughly slow and dull. Is probably and as I've said before, that's one of the worst things the Doctor can be, is slow and very, very boring. It's got somewhat of an interesting concept behind it, focusing on a bit of an allegory of the apartheid in South Africa, of wanting to segregate up the different species on Solos or Sonos or whatever it is that I can't remember what the place is called, that they're on the planet they end up on. It is at least one of the few stories that isn't set on Earth, when they go and end up on on the polluted world of Solos. That's at least something a little bit extra to it. And there's some fascinating look at people developing into different types of creatures through a sort of different life cycle of a being that we have on this planet, which is something that Doctor Who very rarely explores, because so often you go to planets with humanoid type people that develop in humanoid type ways and just get old and die, whereas we see creatures that develop into different type of people through the story as well, which is an interesting concept. But it's just so hecking slow to get there. It's so painful. It's such an unmemorable story, which, given that most of the stories are set on Earth in this era, and yet the Mutants isn't, the fact that I have, just, it's not a story that you can really pick out any particularly memorable visual imagery of, apart from, I guess, the sort of rainbow effect color creature when they turn into something else at the end of the story. And I think there's a mention of the reverse the polarity of the neutron flow, I think, comes from this story as well. But outside of that, it's just so slow and painful and repetitive and just really run of the mill. It doesn't get you interested. It doesn't get you excited. It's just really boring. That's the best I can say about it, really. It's just really boring.
Yeah. This is one of the 2 stories, actually.
Yes, I know. You haven't seen.
Watched. Yeah. That said, I have watched the first 2 episodes. And I just didn't end up finishing it, mostly because I got the season 24 box set at the time. And I just thought, you know what, I'm going to try and finish that. And then I thought, you know what, it's been too long. Let's wait a bit to watch it. Well, not really because it had been too long, because I didn't really like it. Yeah, I think it was it seemed painfully slow from the get-go, really. I didn't really like it that much. So we might as well finish this with my number 1 favorite.
Yes, I'm looking forward to this.
This is a bit of an odd one. It's Frontier in Space.
Ah, brilliant. Very
Thank you.
nice.
Yes.
Yes, I
I,
enjoy Frontier in Space.
yeah, I feel this is a very like aggressively science fiction story. I feel there's lots of like
Mm,
epics, like space opera elements, like you were saying. There's quite a lot of like alien politics, which lots of people say they find really boring, like in the Pelodon stories. I
mhm.
I don't mind it. I think I'm kind of indifferent about it really. Just all of the different like races that are just all against the Doctor and Joe. We've got the humans, we've got the Daleks, we've got the Ogrons, we've got the Draconians. Like everyone is against them, and it's just a classic example of them getting caught in the crossfire between two planets.
Yeah,
I feel it's really
mm,
interesting. Um,
absolutely.
all the stuff at the end, lots of people say it sort of loses it a bit towards the end. It's very rushed, and with the whole Daleks thing. I I kind of like how the Daleks appear at the end. I feel it's a nice setup to tie
Yeah.
with the Daleks, even if it didn't really live up to that. But on its
Mm.
own, I feel it's a really, really fantastic six-parter. This is probably my third favorite Doctor Who story ever,
Okay.
after
Nice.
probably the War Games and Heaven Sent.
Mhm.
Yeah,
Mhm.
it's a really, really fantastic story. And episode four is a really just I want to highlight episode four in particular because it's literally just the third Doctor, Joe, and the Master. Just it's basically just constant banter between them three. It's just fantastic.
Yeah. Yeah.
And yeah, it's really really good story. I could talk about this for hours, but I'm going to stop because we've been talking about this for an hour, and I don't want it to drag on to two of them. So
Yes,
yes,
yes, exactly. But no, it's a great story. It
yeah.
really is a great story. Yeah, I mentioned earlier, I
Mhm.
thoroughly enjoy it.
Yeah, brilliant. So yeah, that was a really good discussion. Um, so yeah, everyone, what if you're still listening? What did you think of the Third Doctor's era? What are your number one least
Mm.
favorites and favorites? How much do you agree with me and Elliot? So yes, thank you for watching. Actually, no, I've not really done this section before, but just overall thoughts on the Pertwee era.
I think the Pertwee era is my favorite era of the classic series.
Yeah.
Is it my favorite era of Doctor Who? It'd be that or the Capaldi era. Those would be the
Yes.
two that'd be vying for the top spot for me. Are they, as we've said, fundamentally, sure, there's a few that are really a bit dull and boring, like the Mutants, like Time Monster, like Monster of Pelodon. But fundamentally, there's so many great stories in there. There's so many, season 7 hasn't got a bad story. They're all top tier. Like it's just full of such great Doctor Who. Sure, it's in large quarters, particularly earlier on in its era, it's probably more serious than some of the later Doctor Who we see. Season 7 is probably one of the most grim and dark feeling Doctor Who seasons we ever had. There's a lot of, it's just quite the concepts and the kind of the way it's shot and just the feeling of the series is quite, dark and grim. But the stories themselves are so gritty and brilliant. And I think that storytelling just continues and shows the creativity of the writing team at the time of Terrence Dicks, of Barry Letts, of Robert Holmes, of I guess Bob Baker and Dave Marsden to an extent, Malcolm Hulke, all these different writers who just wrote such classic stories of this era, alongside the brilliant performances of John Pertwee, Katie Manning, Ros Delgado. They're kind of the big three of the era, but obviously you've also got Caroline John playing Liz Shaw, who I think is a very underrated and forgotten companion from season 7. It's a real shame. I think she's great. She's a different sort of companion because she's the scientist. So I guess that's why they got rid of her, because she didn't quite work. But I just fundamentally really enjoy her performance that she gives for that season as well. And obviously we meet Sarah Jane at the end of the year as well. But yeah, overall, I think it's just brilliant. And I would also recommend actually, it's an era that's really worth watching in order.
Yeah.
There's eras of the show where, it's a lot easier to kind of just dip into random stories, but actually because you've got the Doctor stuck on Earth and that kind of develops over time, him trying to fix the TARDIS, you've got the Master in prison for some stories, like the way that kind of plays out if you watch them kind of in story order, I think actually really really benefits the viewing experience. Not it's not to the extent that you have in the early JNT stuff where the stories literally lead into one another. That doesn't really happen here, but just kind of the way that the characters are introduced and carry on, I think it really does benefit from that. But yeah, fundamentally it's a great era of Doctor Who.
Oh yeah, absolutely. What you were saying about it only maybe tying with the Capaldi era. Yeah, I agree again. I was going to say the third Doctor era or the 12th Doctor era. Yeah, they're probably my two favorite. And what you were saying about Liz, yeah, she was a really great companion. I feel like I've got loads of like Doctor Who like book sort of things that have lists of all the like doctors and their companions and whatever.
Yeah.
And Liz isn't in a lot of them because obviously she was only in 4 stories compared to insane amounts from others like Jamie and Joe and Sarah Jane. It's easy to get lost in that. But yeah, I feel her exit as well. It was I don't know, it was just very abrupt and sudden. Like there was just one throwaway line from the Brigadier. Like that was it, It was hardly a companion departure, really, because she didn't actually leave in Inferno. That it's implied that there was more in between. But generally, it's a really fantastic era. And what you were saying about watching it in order, I do agree. There is the stuff. I feel there's sort of like the first beginnings of like a story arc in season 8 with the dematerialization circuit. That sort of ends the colony in space, I think, and it starts in Terror of the Auton. So I definitely recommend watching it in order as well. Thank you for being on this podcast, Elliot. And we will see you next time, everyone, for the best and worst of Who, where I discuss the Tom